Hi, I'm Dr. Lucy Cunnama and welcome to this part 3 of Costing and Economic Evaluation. In this lecture, we're briefly going to go over how one should amortize or annuitize capital items. We're going to look at adjusting for inflation, and we're just going to touch on purchasing power parity. So these are two good resources that were developed with a team under the Global Health Costing Consortium, which is an endeavor that I was part of. The first is a reference case for estimating the costs of global health services and interventions, and a reference case provides a framework and different principles for how one can undertake a process, so in this case for costing. This is also repeated in costing guideline for tuberculosis interventions that we wrote together with WHO and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So under these, Principle 12 relates to capital costs being appropriately annuitized or depreciated to reflect the expected life of capital items. And Principle 13, where relevant, an appropriate discount rate, inflation and exchange rate should be used and clearly stated. And these were developed along with other principles to try and improve our reporting as well as our methods. So when we're amortizing capital items, we do this in order to have capital and recurrent items be combined in a meaningful way. So capital costs should be amortized or annuitized or depreciated to reflect the expected life years of these capital inputs. So the life expectancy of a building might be 30 years, whereas for a piece of laboratory equipment, it may be that the expected life years are only 10, and that might be more realistic. We do need to think about what figure we use for different buildings. In some countries, it might be that a building would actually be expected to last less than 30 years. But what we're thinking here is that if we took a building and replaced it, what would the value be? And then can we spread this over the expected life years of the building? When we come to training, although the training might occur just within 1 year, the effects of that training might last longer than 1 year. So we can consider this a capital item. And if we do consider the effects to last longer than 1 year, we would need to amortize or annuitize as we would any capital asset, for instance, a building, equipment, furniture, or vehicles. So for training, we might use 2 years as its estimated life years. The usual interest rate used in South Africa and in other countries is 3%. And you'll see a little bit more about that in that reference case that I just mentioned. Here we're just going to go through a worked example so that you can become a little bit familiar with how to go about the practicalities of actually amortizing. So this is a worked example, and the figures are obviously hypothetical. So if we are taking a building and we are going to say that it's going to last for 30 years. In step 1, our life expectancy is set at 30 years. Step 2 is then to establish the current replacement value or price of the capital item. So here, let's say that this building costs $300,000 to replace. In step 3, we need to take our amortization table to read off the amortization factor, and this is based on the number of life years, 30, and the desired interest rate. So this is a portion of the table here that you can see, and we look at N, the number of expected life years, and we set this at 30 because we think that the building will last for 30 years. And then we go to 3%, which is the interest rate that we're going to use. And if we look at the place where those two things intersect, 30 and 3%, we can see that the rate that we're going to use is 19.6. So here we're going to use 19.6 Step 4A is to divide the current replacement value by this amortization factor that we just found on our amortization table, and this gives us our amortized cost. So we're going to take our $300,000 and divide this by 19.6, and we're going to get $15,306. So that is our amortized cost. Or if we use 0%, then we just divide this cost by the number of years to provide the amortized cost. So here, if we use 0%, we're going to take our 300,000 and divide it by 30, and we'd get a rate, or an amortized cost rather, of $10,000. One can then use this annual equivalent cost of $15,306 when we're working out the cost of space. So for instance, if the building space is used for HIV care and it's the full building space that's used, then the space cost $15,306 for HIV care for that year. And in that way we can combine it meaningfully with the other recurrent items that we're going to have. However, if 30% of that building is used exclusively for outpatient TB visits, then the estimated annual cost of that space for outpatient TB visits is almost a third of the total building cost. So a third of that $15,306, which would be $4,592. So we would say that the TB space for outpatient visits costs this amount. If we then have 100 outpatient visits made for TB in the year, the cost per TB outpatient visit for the space would be $46. And in that way we can allocate the costs. When we are adjusting for inflation, there are a few different ways of doing this, but one of the ways is to use the CPI and or the medical price index. We use CPI for items which are not medically related. So for instance, if we're going to inflate the cost of a table, we would use the CPI, whereas if we use a piece of medical equipment, we would actually use the medical price index. So inflation measures the change in prices over time within a country, and in South Africa, where we're based, we find that inflation does affect us. In other countries, it doesn't necessarily affect the country so much, and in countries like Zimbabwe, inflation is quite huge. So the way that we use CPI is that we look up the CPI table for the particular country that we're interested in, and in this instance we've used the CPI for South Africa. And we need to look at the relevant years. So if we're inflating to our current year, we need to make sure that we have our current table. And Stats SA is a good source if you are looking for South African data. So what we do here is we're going to calculate our inflator, and this is our CPI of the year to which you want to convert, divided by the CPI of the year being converted. So if, for instance, we have cost information or price information in 2013 rands, and we want to inflate this to 2015 rands, we would have the CPI for 2015 and the CPI for 2013, and we would divide the CPI for 2015, which is 114.7, by that 103.4 for the CPI for 2013, and we get an inflator of 1.109. We would then use this, so say for instance one of our items costs 797.40, and we want to convert that to 2015 rands. We would multiply that 797.4 by our inflator, and we would find that the 2015 Rand equivalent is 884.54 cents. And that's how we would easily do an inflation. In terms of adjusting for purchasing power parity, this measures the difference in price and exchange rate between different countries at a given time, and it's done in order to understand how much something costs in one country relative to another, and this is done to convert to international dollars. So the example that's often used is something that is of a standard quality, so a McDonald's burger in one country compared to a McDonald's burger in another country. We look at what the actual price is of that McDonald's burger, and that gives us an indication of how much it actually costs between the different countries. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you soon.